So today we're going to start discussing some of the poetry terms that we will use to analyze the poems that we will be discussing in class. Alliteration is kind of a neat term because it analyzes how a poem sounds, which is unique because we don't analyze how a short story sounds or how a novel sounds. And alliteration is the repetition of similar consonant sounds in poetry, and these consonant sounds are at the beginning of words that are in close proximity to one another. Here's an example. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." You'll probably notice that this is Edgar Allan Poe. It's The Raven. So let's look at some of the examples of alliteration in this poem. So, if you look in this line right here, while weak and weary, all start with the same letter, which is W. If you look in this line, nodded, nearly napping, this all starts with N, but it doesn't have to start with the same letter. It has to start with the same sound. If you look in this second line here, quaint and curious start with the same sound, but they begin with different letters. Remember, some letters start with the same sound, but they are different letters like C and K or C and S for that matter. Connotation is the emotion or feelings associated with the word beyond the literal. Look at the words slender and skinny. Think about which one has the more positive and which one has the more negative connotation. For example, slender means fit and shape, whereas skinny might mean something more like this. So slender definitely has the more positive connotation, whereas skinny might have a more negative connotation. But denotation is the dictionary definition of a word, the literal meaning, where slender and skinny literally mean the exact same thing. Let's talk about iambic pentameter. You're going to hear this term a lot. You may have heard this term when you talked about Shakespeare last year, because Shakespeare wrote about 80% of his plays in iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is the most common form of English poetry. It has 10 syllables in each line, so the easiest way to check to see if you have iambic pentameter as a poem is literally to count each syllable in each line and check for 10 syllables, and it follows an unstressed, stressed pattern. I'll teach you guys how to look for this more closely in class. Blank verse. Blank verse is poetry written in unrhymed iambic pentameter. So to check for this, you would look to see first, does the poem have 10 syllables in each line, but does the poem not rhyme? Let's look at an example. This comes from Romeo and Juliet. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. So you'll notice that breaks and sun doesn't rhyme. Let's look at this first line. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks has 10 syllables, and it follows this unstressed stress pattern. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? Man, this is romantic stuff. If some guy says this to you, ladies, you might become a couplet. A couplet is 2 consecutive lines of poetry that rhyme. I like to think of it as they love each other so much, they rhyme with each other. Let's look at an example. Let the winged fancy roam, pleasure never is at home. So roam and home rhyme with each other. Free verse is similar and different to blank verse. So free verse is poetry that lacks meter and rhyme scheme. So neither free verse nor blank verse rhyme, but blank verse has 10 syllables per line and it follows an unstressed stress pattern, but free verse doesn't have any meter at all. So the test for this is to see, does the poem not rhyme at all? And do you have a different number of syllables in each line? You can kind of tell just from looking here that you would have a different number of syllables in each line. So this says, little tree, little silent Christmas tree, you are so little, you are more like a flower. Who found you in the green forest, and were you very sorry to come away? See, I will comfort you because you smell so sweetly. So in this first line, you've got little tree, 3 syllables. Little silent Christmas tree, definitely not 3 syllables. So you'll see that the syllables change from line to line, therefore you don't have a consistent meter. Metaphor, it's comparing 2 unlike things using like or as. It can be one line, it can extend throughout the whole poem. So this one says, I made my song a coat covered with embroideries out of old mythologies from heel to throat. But the fools caught it, wore it in the world's eyes as though they'd wrought it. Song, let them take it, for there is more enterprise in walking naked. So in this poem, the whole poem is a metaphor, where the coat is a metaphor for his writing style. And he's saying that other people are wearing his coat. So essentially what he's doing is he's accusing people of copying his writing style and wearing his coat. Let's look at simile. Simile is comparing two unlike things using like or as. So she was as lovely as a flower. Meter is a generally regular pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables, and this is what gives poetry its musical or sing-song equality. So U is a symbol that we use for unstressed syllables, slash is a symbol that we use for stressed syllables. Lyric poetry is poetry aimed only at expressing a speaker's emotions or thoughts. Most poetry kind of falls under this category because it's usually people's emotions that causes them to want to write poetry in the first place. So this says, we wear the mask that grins and lies, it hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. So in this poem, the poet is saying that on the surface, we wear a mask that smiles, but it's hiding this pain. We have bleeding hearts underneath this mask. So this poet is talking about feelings. In this poem, it says, I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed against the earth's sweet flowing breast, a tree that looks at God all day and lifts her leafy arms to pray, a tree that may in summer wear a nest of robins in her hair, upon whose bosom snow has lain, who intimately lives with rain. Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. So this poet is not really expressing her feelings, more so her thoughts about trees. Narrative poetry, on the other hand, tells a story. Let's look at the next example. It says, the outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville Nine that day. The score stood 4-2 with but one inning more to play. And then when Cooney died at first and Barrows did the same, a pall-like silence fell upon the patrons of the game. A straggling few got up to go in deep despair. The rest clung to that hope which springs eternal in the human breast. They thought if only Casey could but get a whack at that, we'd put up even money now with Casey at the bat. So this poem isn't talking about thoughts and feelings, but telling the story of a baseball game. Personification is a big one in poetry, and that's giving human characteristics to non-human items. So the example says, I'm having trouble fighting off this virus, kind of personifying a virus which is not human. Since we're talking about poetry, we might as well define it. Poetry is a type of rhythmic, compressed language that uses figurative language and imagery to appeal to the reader's emotions and imagination. This is a really broad definition. As we kind of discussed in class, if you intend it to be a poem, it can be a poem. And rhythm. Rhythm is the musical quality of poetry created by meter. So that series and combination of unstressed and stressed beats gives it that musical quality. Emily Dickinson was famous for this. Listen to When I Read It, because I could not stop for death. He kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality. So that combination of unstressed and stressed beats gives it that sing-song equality. And actually, you can sing all of Emily Dickinson's poems to the theme song of Gilligan's Island. Rhyme. Those are words with the same accented vowel sounds and all the sounds that follow. So cat rhymes with fat, sword rhymes with lord, drone rhymes with phone, some rhymes with numb, see you later rhymes with alligator, nothing rhymes with orange. Don't tell me door hinge, that's not true rhyme, that's something called slant rhyme. We'll talk about that later. And that leads us to rhyme scheme, and that's the pattern of rhyme within a poem. And we use letters of the alphabet to mark that off. So it says, two roads diverged in a yellow wood. We always give the first line an A. And then if the second line rhymes with the first line, we would give it an A as well. This one says, I'm sorry I could not travel both. Both does not rhyme with wood, so we would give it a B. And B, one traveler long I stood. So stood rhymes with wood, so that would get an A. And look down one as far as I could. Could rhymes with wood, so we would give that an A. To where it bent in the undergrowth. Growth does not rhyme with wood, but it rhymes with both, so that would get a B. So then the pattern of this poem is A, B, A, B. And lastly, we're going to talk about stanza. And that's a group of lines forming a single unit in a poem, like a poetry paragraph. So you can just see here in the visuals of this poem, this poet is grouping this poem in 3-line stanzas. And this is a great place to look for shifts or changes in either the topic, the mood, or the theme of the poem. So these are the terms we'll be talking about tomorrow. You may want to watch the video again just to familiarize yourself with these terms. Make sure you know these when you come into class tomorrow. Thanks for watching.